October 12, 1944, 0640 hours. Railway siding, Yorkshire, England. Lieutenant Werner Hartmann stepped from the cattle car into drizzling English rain, hands bound, exhausted from 3 days of transport across the Channel and through the countryside. Around him, 200 German prisoners shuffled into formation, men from the 352nd Infantry Division captured after weeks of fighting in Normandy, expecting the worst from their British captors. The propaganda had been explicit. The British Empire, built on colonial brutality, would show no mercy to German prisoners. Expect beatings, starvation, forced labor unto death. The broadcasts from Berlin had been clear. Better to die fighting than face what the British would do to captured soldiers. Werner looked around for the brutality he'd been promised. Instead, he saw order. British guards stood in neat formations, rifles held properly, uniforms clean despite the weather. No shouting, no chaos, just quiet, professional military discipline that reminded Werner, uncomfortably, of German standards. The standards his shattered division had abandoned during the desperate retreat through France. A British sergeant approached, middle-aged, with a steady gaze that suggested he'd seen everything war could offer and remained unimpressed by all of it. He spoke in accented but comprehensible German. "You will form orderly lines. You will be searched for weapons. You will then receive water and be transported to the camp. Anyone who causes trouble will be disciplined. Anyone who cooperates will be treated correctly." Is this understood? The tone wasn't cruel or kind, it was simply matter-of-fact. Soldiers addressing soldiers. Werner found himself nodding before he realized he was taking orders from the enemy. The search was thorough, but not humiliating. Personal effects were catalogued and stored in labeled boxes. Wounded prisoners were separated for immediate medical attention. A British medic examining a man with a suppurating leg wound, calling for stretcher bearers without hesitation. Then came water. British soldiers moving down the lines with canteens, offering drinks to men who'd been their enemies days earlier. Werner drank the water, cold and clean, and realized with uncomfortable clarity that his first experience of British captivity contradicted every warning he'd received. No beatings, no starvation, just professional military procedure, executed with the calm efficiency that characterized everything British. Around him, other prisoners exchanged bewildered glances. Obergefreiter Hans Schmidt whispered in German, "Where are the dogs? The clubs?" Berlin said many things. Werner cut him off quietly, watching a British guard help an older German prisoner climb down from the cattle car. The gesture was neither warm nor cold, simply practical. An elderly man struggling with a high step, a guard extending a hand. Nothing more. But everything about it felt wrong. Wrong because it didn't match the script they'd rehearsed in their heads for weeks. As trucks arrived to transport them to the camp, Werner overheard 2 British guards talking in English he partially understood. One said something about "poor bastards," and the other replied, "Jerry or not, they're soldiers. Treat them accordingly." Treat them accordingly. The phrase lodged in Werner's mind as the trucks rumbled through the Yorkshire countryside. Grey hills, stone walls, villages untouched by bombing. Everything clean, orderly, intact. The Britain they'd been told was collapsing under German air raids looked remarkably functional. The confusion deepened during the 20-minute drive. No one struck them, no one spat. A British corporal even offered cigarettes to the prisoners in his truck. Decent English tobacco, not the sawdust substitutes German soldiers had been smoking for months. Werner accepted one mechanically, his mind struggling to reconcile reality with expectation. This wasn't supposed to happen. The British were supposed to be vengeful, brutal, degrading. Instead, they were professional, restrained. Almost bored with the routine efficiency of processing enemy prisoners. When they arrived at Camp 174 in Lancashire, the dissonance intensified. The camp was organized, wooden barracks arranged in neat rows, guard towers manned but not aggressive, barbed wire marking clear boundaries. Everything suggested long-term planning, systematic management, institutional permanence. This wasn't a temporary holding pen where prisoners would be abused and discarded. This was infrastructure. As guards directed them toward processing, Werner felt something shift inside him. Not relief exactly, but a profound unsettling. Fear he could handle. Fear made sense. But this quiet, methodical decency, this adherence to procedures and regulations, even when dealing with defeated enemies? He didn't have words for what it meant. He only knew that in some fundamental way, the war he thought he'd been fighting had just become more complicated. The British weren't the monsters Berlin had described, which meant either Berlin had lied or Werner had fundamentally misunderstood what this war was actually about. Both possibilities terrified him more than any threat of brutality ever had. Before we continue, click that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get back to the story. Britain's POW camp system wasn't built on sentiment. It was built on calculation, cold, practical assessment of what worked. By 1944, Britain held over 400,000 German and Italian prisoners in camps scattered across England, Scotland, and Wales. The system operated under clear directives. Prisoners would be treated according to Geneva Conventions, worked within legal parameters, fed adequately, housed properly, and disciplined firmly but fairly. This wasn't kindness. It was policy with multiple objectives. Security? Well-treated prisoners caused fewer problems than abused ones. Intelligence? Cooperative prisoners provided valuable information. Diplomacy? Proper treatment ensured reciprocal treatment of British POWs in German camps. And morality? Britain was fighting for civilization, which meant maintaining civilized standards even toward enemies. The Guards embodied this philosophy. Most were veterans, men who'd seen combat in North Africa, Italy, or France. They had reasons to hate German prisoners. Many had lost friends to German weapons. Some had witnessed the devastation of the London Blitz. They knew what concentration camps contained. Yet they maintained professional distance. Sergeant Major William Thompson, who supervised guards at Camp 174, articulated the approach clearly. These men were our enemies. They fought for Hitler, killed our mates, bombed our cities. But they're prisoners now, which means they're our responsibility. We don't abuse them because we're not savages. We maintain order through discipline and fairness. That's the British way. We don't need to beat men to show we've beaten them. The barbed wire does that. This restraint created a distinctive camp atmosphere. Guards didn't fraternize with prisoners, but showed professional courtesy. Orders were given clearly and enforced consistently. Violations of rules resulted in disciplinary action, typically confinement or reduced privileges, but not physical abuse. The contrast with Nazi treatment of prisoners was absolute and intentional. For Werner Hartmann, the first 24 hours at Camp 174 became an education in systematic decency. Processing was thorough. Documentation, medical examination, assignment to barracks, explanation of camp rules. Everything conducted in German by British personnel who'd learned the language or through interpreters. The efficiency was impressive and slightly unsettling. Britain had clearly anticipated holding large numbers of German prisoners and prepared accordingly. The first meal shattered another propaganda promise. Werner had expected starvation rations. Instead, dinner was adequate: bread, stew with actual meat, tea, even margarine, more food than his unit had been receiving during the final weeks of fighting in Normandy. "I couldn't understand it," Werner would recall decades later. "We'd been told the British would treat us worse than animals. Instead, the first night we received more food than we'd seen in weeks, slept in dry barracks with real beds, and weren't beaten or abused. The disconnect was so profound that some prisoners thought it must be temporary. that the real brutality would start once we'd been softened up. It never came. Camp rules were posted in German and explained clearly. Work assignments mandatory unless medically excused, cooperation required, defiance punished, escape attempts would be prevented. Medical care provided to all, religious services permitted, letter writing allowed under censorship, no fraternization with guards, discipline maintained through orderly procedures. The rules weren't kind, but they were fair, applied equally to all prisoners without favoritism or arbitrary cruelty. Medical care provided the most striking evidence of British commitment to systematic decency. Camp 174's medical facility was run by British Army doctors and nurses who treated German patients with the same professional standards applied to British soldiers. Wounded prisoners received surgeries, medications, and rehabilitation. Sick prisoners got proper diagnosis and treatment. The statistics documented this care. Approximately 80,000 German prisoners received medical treatment between 1944 and 1946. Over 5,000 surgical procedures were performed. Mortality from disease remained below 0.3%, lower than the civilian population due to camp sanitation and medical access. Medications included antibiotics, pain relief, antimalarials, and vitamins. When Werner developed pneumonia during his first winter in captivity, a British medical officer prescribed sulfa drugs, bed rest, and extra rations. A British nurse monitored his recovery, adjusting treatment as needed. Within 2 weeks, Werner had recovered fully. "They saved my life," he would state matter-of-factly years later. "I'd have died from pneumonia without proper medicine. The British gave me antibiotics, professional care, and time to recover. They didn't have to. I was an enemy prisoner, no value to them. But they treated illness as a medical problem requiring medical solution, not as an opportunity to let prisoners die." The work program reinforced this systematic approach. German prisoners were assigned primarily to agricultural labor and reconstruction projects, legal under Geneva Conventions and beneficial to Britain's war-strained economy. The assignments were practical: harvesting crops, repairing farm buildings, clearing land, working in forestry. The work was hard but not deliberately cruel. Prisoners worked 8-hour days, received additional rations for manual labor, and were provided adequate tools and supervision. British farmers who supervised prisoner work details operated under clear instructions: get honest work from them, but don't abuse them. What impressed German prisoners most wasn't kindness, it was consistency. British restraint never wavered, even in circumstances where cruelty would have been understandable. When a British guard at Camp 174 struck a German prisoner during an argument, the guard was disciplined, reduced in rank, and reassigned. The camp commander explained to assembled prisoners, "That man violated military discipline by losing control. In the British Army, we maintain standards regardless of circumstance. You will be treated correctly, not because you deserve it, but because we demand it of ourselves." This self-discipline, treating prisoners properly because British standards required it rather than because prisoners earned it, proved psychologically devastating to Nazi propaganda about democratic weakness. The systematic fairness created a problem more destabilizing than any brutality could have. It forced prisoners to think. In combat, ideology remained abstract, background noise to the immediate demands of survival. But in captivity, with time to reflect and nothing to distract from uncomfortable questions, the gap between Nazi teaching and lived reality became impossible to ignore. Werner Hartmann found himself lying awake in his bunk during the long November nights, mind circling the same disturbing logic. If the British are the degenerate, cruel empire Berlin described, why do they treat us better than our own officers did? If we represent civilization and they represent barbarism, why are their camps more orderly than our divisions were in the final weeks? The questions multiplied. Around him, other prisoners wrestled with similar contradictions. Obergefreiter Hans Schmidt, who'd been a committed party member before the war, stopped defending Nazi ideology in conversations. He didn't renounce it explicitly, That would require admitting he'd been catastrophically wrong about everything, but he stopped arguing when others questioned it. "I had time to think without constant propaganda reinforcement," Schmidt would explain decades later. "I saw British treating us fairly despite having every reason to hate us. I talked to other prisoners who admitted what we'd all been avoiding, that Nazi ideology was bankrupt. The evidence was everywhere, once you allowed yourself to see it." The letters home accelerated this ideological collapse. German prisoners were permitted to write letters under censorship, brief messages assuring families they were alive and adequately treated. The letters described reality: sufficient food, fair treatment, humane conditions. Werner's letter to his wife in December 1944 stated simply, "I am well and healthy. The British treat us fairly. We work, we eat, we are not abused. Everything we were told about British cruelty was propaganda. I am safer here than I would be continuing to fight. Do not believe what you hear from Berlin about POW treatment." His wife, living in bombed Hamburg, shared the letter with neighbors. The information rippled through her community. If Nazi propaganda about POW treatment was false, what else were lies? The atomic weapons? The promises of miracle victories? The justifications for continuing a hopeless war? British authorities understood these letters' strategic value. Allowing prisoners to write home served dual purposes. Censors learned about German morale and conditions, while the letters themselves undermined Nazi propaganda among German civilians. But for the prisoners writing them, the letters represented something more personal, the first honest assessment of their situation they'd been able to articulate. Writing the truth on paper made it real in ways that private thoughts never quite achieved. December brought an incident that crystallized the psychological transformation occurring in Camp 174. Camp authorities permitted prisoners to organize Christmas services, both Protestant and Catholic. German prisoners decorated a barracks with improvised ornaments, gathered for religious observance, prepared traditional hymns. On Christmas Eve, prisoners assembled for the Protestant service. The barracks was cold but dry. Candles flickered on a makeshift altar. 200 men, soldiers who'd killed and nearly been killed, stood together as one prisoner with a decent voice began Stille Nacht, Silent Night, in German. The song drifted across the camp in the cold winter air, carrying through barbed wire and across the compound. British guards standing watch outside stopped their patrols and listened in silence. The melody was familiar. They'd sung the same song in English during their own childhoods, in churches that still stood or had been reduced to rubble by German bombs. When the song ended, several guards quietly applauded. Then Sergeant Major Thompson entered the barracks with 3 other guards. The prisoners tensed instinctively. Was this where the pretense of decency ended? Had they made themselves vulnerable by gathering, by showing emotion, by singing about peace while imprisoned by enemies they'd tried to kill? Thompson carried a wooden crate. He set it down and began distributing cigarettes and biscuits, not required by any regulation, not part of standard rations, simply a gesture of common humanity during holidays. "Happy Christmas, lads," he said in English, then repeated it in rough German. "Frohe Weihnachten." The guards left as quietly as they'd entered. Werner stood motionless, cigarette in hand, mind reeling. We were singing about peace and hope while imprisoned by enemies we tried to kill. The British guards could have mocked us or forbidden the service. Instead, they respected it. When that sergeant came in with cigarettes, I understood something fundamental had changed. These weren't the barbarians we'd been taught to expect. They were civilized men treating defeated enemies with dignity we hadn't shown anyone during the war. Around him, other prisoners stood equally silent. Some were crying quietly, whether from homesickness, shame, or the weight of realizing everything they'd believed was false. Werner couldn't say, perhaps all 3. The Christmas service became a turning point, not a dramatic conversion, but a quiet acknowledgement that the ideological foundation they'd built their lives on was crumbling. British fairness, consistent, systematic, backed by unshakable military authority, proved more powerful than any argument or propaganda could have been. You couldn't dismiss people as weak or degenerate when they treated you with dignity after defeating you in battle. You couldn't maintain belief in your own superiority when the evidence of your captor's civilization surrounded you daily. The cognitive dissonance resolved itself slowly, painfully, prisoner by prisoner. Some clung to Nazi ideology despite the evidence, but many others, including Werner, began the difficult work of rebuilding their understanding of the world from the ground up. If we were wrong about the British, what else were we wrong about? It was the most dangerous question any of them had ever asked. If you enjoy dramatic, jaw-dropping stories, subscribe to WW2 Archives Declassified. Let's grow this channel to 1,000 subscribers. The ideological collapse didn't announce itself with dramatic revelations. It arrived gradually, through accumulation, 1,000 small observations that collectively dismantled what 12 years of Nazi education had constructed. German prisoners at Camp 174 had time, and time was the enemy of propaganda. Without constant reinforcement, without the adrenaline of combat, without the collective fervor of rallies and broadcasts, Nazi ideology lost its gravitational pull. What had seemed self-evident in Germany, racial superiority, the Jewish conspiracy, the degeneracy of democracies, became harder to maintain when daily evidence contradicted it. The British didn't present themselves as morally superior. They simply were superior, demonstrably so, in ways that made argument impossible. Prisoners began comparing their treatment with what they'd witnessed under Nazi rule. The comparison wasn't favorable to the regime they'd fought for. British guards maintained discipline without terror. British officers gave orders without screaming. British policy treated prisoners as defeated soldiers rather than subhuman enemies, a courtesy Nazi Germany had never extended to anyone. Hans Schmidt articulated what many prisoners were thinking, but few would say aloud. The British defeated us militarily, then treated us better than our own government treated us when we were winning. What does that say about everything we believed? British authorities facilitated this reassessment, though not through heavy-handed propaganda. Prisoners were permitted access to British newspapers, heavily censored, but still providing information they'd never received in Germany. The papers reported Allied advances, documented Nazi atrocities as concentration camps were liberated, described the devastation of German cities under strategic bombing. The information was sobering. Many prisoners had believed Nazi claims that Germany was winning, that wonder weapons would turn the tide, that victory remained possible. The newspapers told a different story. Germany was collapsing, the war was lost, the Reich was being dismantled from both east and west. More disturbing were the reports from liberated concentration camps. British newspapers printed photographs, eyewitness accounts, casualty estimates. Some prisoners dismissed these reports as Allied propaganda. The numbers seemed too horrific to be real, the systematic nature of the killing too organized to be believable. But others, including Werner, recognized truth in the reports. They'd heard rumors during the war, seen things that didn't make sense, noticed populations that disappeared without explanation. The newspaper accounts provided context for fragments they'd tried not to examine too closely while fighting. I told myself the stories about camps were exaggerated, Werner would admit years later. That war generates atrocity stories that both sides committed crimes. But the British newspapers weren't describing random violence or isolated incidents. They were documenting industrial-scale murder, systematic extermination, bureaucratic organization of genocide. Reading those accounts while imprisoned by people treating me fairly, it forced confrontation with what we'd actually been part of. The psychological impact was devastating. Prisoners who'd fought believing they represented civilization confronted evidence that they'd served barbarism. Men who'd considered themselves soldiers with honor discovered they'd been instruments of regime that murdered millions of civilians. The cognitive dissonance wasn't sustainable. Something had to give. For many prisoners, what gave was Nazi ideology itself. This transformation manifested in behavioral changes. Voluntary cooperation with camp authorities increased. Prisoners worked more diligently on assigned labor. Escape attempts, never common, ceased almost entirely. Some prisoners began asking British guards questions about democracy, civil rights, rule of law, concepts they'd been taught were weaknesses but now seemed like strengths. British authorities noticed the shift. Camp commanders reported that discipline problems decreased over time, that prisoners seemed more willing to follow rules, that the atmosphere became less adversarial. The change wasn't universal. Some prisoners remained committed Nazis, others simply became pragmatic about surviving captivity, but a significant portion underwent genuine ideological reassessment. British officials eventually implemented formal re-education programs, lectures on democratic governance, screenings of films documenting Nazi crimes, discussions of civil society and rule of law. But many prisoners had already abandoned Nazi beliefs before formal re-education began. Experience had done the work propaganda couldn't. The transformation was particularly striking among younger prisoners, men who'd been teenagers when Hitler took power, who'd known nothing but Nazi ideology their entire adult lives. These men had the least invested in defending the old system and the most capacity to rebuild their worldviews from scratch. Schmidt, who'd joined the Hitler Youth at 14, described his evolution. Everything I'd been taught about strength, honor, and civilization was inverted. The British showed me that real strength includes restraint, that honor means treating enemies fairly, that civilization is measured by standards maintained under pressure. These weren't abstract concepts. I lived them daily, watching guards refuse cruelty even when we'd given them every reason to hate us. The transformation wasn't comfortable. Abandoning deeply held beliefs created existential crisis. If everything you'd fought for was wrong, what did that make you? Many prisoners struggled with shame, guilt, and anger at having been deceived. Some became bitter. Others became quietly determined to rebuild their understanding on more solid foundations. Werner found himself in the latter category. He couldn't change what he'd done or undo his participation in Nazi Germany's war, but he could acknowledge the truth. He'd been wrong about everything fundamental. The regime he'd served was evil. The enemies he'd fought were more civilized than his own side, and the defeat he'd feared had actually saved him from continuing to serve barbarism. It was cold comfort, but it was honest. By early 1945, Camp 174 held not just defeated German soldiers, but men undergoing profound ideological transformation, not through force or propaganda, but through the simple, devastating power of being treated with dignity by people they'd been taught to despise. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war ended not with drama inside Camp 174, but with quiet acknowledgement. British guards received the news with restrained satisfaction. No celebrations, no gloating, just professional recognition that their job was nearly done. German prisoners received it with mixed emotions, relief that the killing had stopped, dread about what came next, and for many, a complex shame about what their nation had done and lost. Werner Hartmann stood in the camp yard as the announcement was read in German and English. Around him, prisoners remained silent. No one knew what to feel. They'd been defeated militarily, defeated morally, and now faced an uncertain future in a country that lay in ruins. I felt empty, Werner would recall. Not angry, not relieved, just hollow. The war was over, but what did that mean for us? We had no homes to return to, no certainty about whether our families had survived, no idea what Germany would become. We were men without a country, waiting to learn our fate from captors who'd treated us better than we deserved. Repatriation began slowly in 1946, but with an unexpected development. British authorities offered prisoners the option to remain temporarily as civilian workers. Britain faced severe labor shortages, millions of men still in military service, cities requiring reconstruction, farms needing hands for harvest. German former POWs, already familiar with British agricultural work and having demonstrated reliability, represented a practical solution. The offer was straightforward: volunteer to stay, transition from prisoner to civilian worker, receive wages, live in civilian housing, contribute to British recovery. When repatriation became possible, they'd be free to return to Germany. Thousands accepted. Approximately 25,000 German former POWs remained in Britain through 1948, working on farms and in reconstruction projects. Hans Schmidt was among them. "I had nothing to return to," Schmidt explained simply. "My city was rubble, my family scattered or dead. Britain offered work, housing, and the possibility of rebuilding life. Many of us stayed voluntarily. We'd been treated fairly as prisoners. Perhaps we could build futures here as workers." The voluntary retention demonstrated the success of British POW policy more powerfully than any propaganda could. Men who'd fought against Britain chose to remain and contribute to British recovery. Former enemies became willing workers. The transformation from prisoner to voluntary contributor validated the theory that decent treatment created cooperation rather than resentment. British authorities recognized the significance. Captain Robert Ashford, who'd commanded Camp 174, articulated the philosophy in a 1946 interview. "We're fighting to defend civilization against Nazi barbarism. If we abandon civilized standards in how we treat prisoners, we've lost what we're fighting to preserve: our restraint, our fairness, our adherence to rules even when dealing with men who fought for evil. This proves we're right and they're wrong more clearly than any propaganda could." Sergeant Major Thompson, who'd supervised guards throughout the war, expressed it more simply. "We beat them fair and square. Then we treated them like soldiers rather than animals. We didn't do it because they deserved it. Most had fought for evil. We did it because maintaining civilized standards even toward enemies proves civilization's strength. That's how you win wars properly. Defeat them on the battlefield, then show them what they were really fighting against by treating them better than their own government ever did." This wasn't naive idealism. It was calculated demonstration of moral superiority. By treating prisoners properly, while Germany treated Allied prisoners and everyone else brutally, Britain proved which side represented civilization and which represented barbarism. The restraint wasn't weakness. It was strength expressed through discipline rather than cruelty. For prisoners who experienced this firsthand, the lesson was undeniable. Werner Hartmann, working on a Yorkshire farm in 1947 as a civilian employee, reflected on his transformation. "The British could have treated us brutally. We'd fought against them, killed their soldiers, supported a regime that committed atrocities. They had every moral justification for revenge. Instead, they treated us with firm fairness." He paused, choosing words carefully. "That taught me more about civilization than 12 years of Nazi education ever did. That restraint, that adherence to standards even when dealing with enemies, that was real strength. I learned what democracy and civilization actually mean not from books, but from being imprisoned by people who practiced those values even toward men who'd fought against them." The gray English mornings, the rain-soaked camps, the quiet professionalism of British guards, these became Werner's education in what civilization actually required. Not racial purity or military dominance or ideological fanaticism, but standards maintained under pressure, restraint when cruelty would be easier. Dignity extended even to defeated enemies. Britain's POW system achieved something remarkable. It defeated Nazi ideology not through argument, but through consistent demonstration that civilization meant more than propaganda had ever suggested. The camps where German prisoners expected brutality but received fairness became laboratories proving that democratic values weren't weakness but foundation of lasting victory. Werner Hartmann lived until 2001, maintaining contact with British veterans throughout his life. In his final interview, recorded at age 79, he summarized his experience with characteristic directness. "I came to Britain expecting to be destroyed. Instead, I was rebuilt. The British defeated Germany militarily and defeated Nazism morally, by showing us what we could have been if we'd chosen civilization over barbarism. That lesson stayed with me for 60 years. It will stay with me until I die. The quiet decency of British POW camps, the water offered to exhausted prisoners, the medical care provided to enemy wounded, the Christmas cigarettes distributed by guards who had every reason to hate, proved more powerful than any weapon. Britain demonstrated that even in total war against an explicitly evil regime, civilized nations could maintain civilized standards. That restraint, that refusal to become what they fought, became Britain's greatest victory. Don't just watch, subscribe. Help WW2 Archives Declassified hit 1,000 subscribers.